Alright, the UFC 324 main card just got announced, and what the heck is the UFC even doing, man? These matchups make absolutely zero sense. Let's get into it. The last thing I want to come off is one of those guys that is just never happy with the matchups that the UFC put together, but I genuinely feel like the matchmakers have been dropping the ball massively this year. I made a video recently after UFC Qatar laying out the very obvious matchups that should be happening next in both the lightweight and welterweight division, and just yesterday Dana White announced the complete opposite of those.
I want to oil you up. What the fuck does that mean?
He made matchups that make zero sense in terms of the rankings, and we've known this for a long time that the UFC doesn't follow the rankings anymore. It's not a system based on the best fights to the best. It's not even really a system of the biggest stars fight the biggest stars either, because why is Justin Gaethje fighting Paddy Pimblett? We all know that Arman Tsarukyan is the rightful #1 contender and deserves to fight Ilia Topuria for the title next, but I knew the most likely route the UFC was going to take was Paddy Pimblett versus Ilia Topuria next, just because that is genuinely the biggest fight you could make in this division. But obviously Ilia Topuria announced that he'll be stepping away for the first quarter of next year because of some personal issues. The UFC decided to go the route of Paddy Pimblett versus Justin Gaethje. Tell me this, how does Justin Gaethje go from getting knocked out by a featherweight to beating a number 12 ranked Rafael Fiziev to now getting an interim title shot? Like I said, Paddy Pimblett kind of made sense just because of the amount of hype he has, but then Justin Gaethje, yes, he's a big name, but he's been doing absolutely nothing but threatening to retire if he doesn't get a title shot. Seems like best case scenario for what the UFC as a company wanted. They obviously didn't want Justin Gaethje to retire, and they obviously didn't want to feed Paddy Pimblett to Arman Tsarukyan, and then they also didn't want to give Arman Tsarukyan the next title shot. So an interim title between Paddy Pimblett and Justin Gaethje makes the most sense for them apparently. If you had told me after that Jared Gordon fight that Paddy Pimblett would be 3 fights away from getting a title shot, bro, I would have crashed out. Look at Paddy Pimblett's last few wins. I don't even need to explain why he doesn't deserve a title shot. Bobby Green, who was on a 1-fight win streak, and then he beat Tony Ferguson, who was on like a 20-fight losing streak, and then he beat Michael Chandler, who... Come on, man. Not to mention, I fully agree with what Ariel Helwani said regarding an interim title fight being the top of the main card, especially over a legitimate title fight in Amanda Nunes versus Kayla Harrison.
I cannot believe that they are headlining this card with that fight. And I cannot believe that you have Kayla versus Amanda Nunes, which some people may say is the biggest and most significant women's title fight of all time. How are you going to put that beneath an interim title fight? And an interim title fight, once again, that does not feature the #1 contender.
I do understand though, if the UFC made Amanda Nunes versus Kayla Harrison the headliner of the first card of 2026, the UFC fan base would have lost their minds in a bad way, even though this is seriously one of the sickest fights on this card. Not to mention, where does this leave Arman Tsarukyan now? I have to make a whole separate video on this because there's so much to dive in, but essentially that UFC Qatar main event was literally pointless. Even if Dan Hooker won and beat the #1 contender, he wouldn't have got a title shot because Ilia Topuria is stepping away. To be honest, I think if Dan Hooker did win that fight, they would have made Paddy versus Dan Hooker for the interim title, especially because the UFC clearly wants to protect Paddy Pimblett, so Dan Hooker would have been an easier fight than Justin Gaethje, in my opinion. I honestly would have much preferred Paddy Pimblett versus Justin Gaethje to be the co-main event of this card and not for an interim title, just for a #1 contender fight after Arman Tsarukyan fights Ilia Topuria. That would have made the most sense to me, especially if Ilia Topuria's next fight is looking most likely to be at the White House, which is in June next year. That would have been a perfect timeline for Arman to fight Ilia Topuria, and then Paddy Pimblett and Justin Gaethje to have the next crack at the title. See, this is what a logical mind thinks. I don't know who was responsible for this January card, but please, what are you doing, man? Like I said, this main card is absolutely stacked, but the way they've pulled it off is just so incredibly disrespectful to the order of how the sport is supposed to play out, and also incredibly disrespectful to Arman, man. He weighed in as a backup fighter to Ilia Topuria versus Charles Oliveira, and then also took a fight which Dana White claimed to be the #1 contender fight.
Dana, earlier this week, you scheduled Arman Tsarukyan to fight Dan Hooker in November.
Yeah.
And will the winner of that fight become the #1 contender in the lightweight division?
Will the number of that? Yeah.
So why is Dana White lying? How can we trust anything he says, man? Dude, if I was Arman Tsarukyan, I would be so mad at the UFC that if I was Arman and I ever won the title, I would retire in that exact moment just to spite the UFC. I think the main thing I'm annoyed about all of this is that Justin Gaethje is actually getting his way in this situation. It sets a bad precedent for the entire company that if you're somewhat of a big name, you can just threaten to retire and you'll be gifted a title shot. We're currently seeing this in the welterweight division, and I know for a fact the UFC is going to now go the route of booking Kamaru Usman versus Islam Makhachev for the next welterweight title fight, even though Ian Gary clearly is the #1 contender, because Kamaru Usman is also kind of threatening to just stand on his rankings.
I'm the biggest in the division, you know, and this is about entertainment. The UFC is an entertainment company. You want to make the biggest fight. It's going to be the winner of JDM and Islam, former pound for pound, current pound for pound.
Even though his ranking is like number 7 or 8, his last win was Buckley, which is a very similar trajectory as Justin Gaethje, both beating guys that were out of the title picture and then just sitting there claiming a title shot. Honestly, Justin Gaethje should have just retired. The UFC should not have played into his hand. They should have just let him go, and I guarantee Justin Gaethje would have came back on his word and asked to fight at the White House, even if it wasn't for a title fight. I also saw that Dana White announced UFC 325, which is Volkanovski versus Diego Lopez 2. I'm sorry guys, you're gonna have to be prepared for like the next 4 videos just being complete rant videos. I'm also a little bit sick, so I'm probably gonna lose my voice with all of the screaming I'm gonna be doing. Sean O'Malley versus Song Yadong is also on this card, as well as Umar Nurmagomedov versus Davison Figueiredo, which those are absolutely sick fights. This card is probably one of the best cards we've gotten in a long time. So it's such a shame that it's headlined by an absolutely ridiculous matchup. This is a clown show, let's just call it what it is. Paddy Pimblett is one of the most unworthy title contenders in recent history. His entire UFC career has been fraudulent, and the UFC has very clearly laid out a very protected path for him to get to the title shot. The fact he avoided fighting Dustin Poirier, Arman Tsarukyan, Max Holloway, Charles Oliveira, but is somehow still getting a title shot is beyond me. His only real test in this division was Michael Chandler. Arman Tsarukyan even said that he was willing to turn around in January and fight for the title if that's what the UFC was proposing. I honestly don't understand why the UFC is still punishing Arman Tsarukyan for pulling out of his title fight against Islam. Like I said, I feel like he's done enough to make up for that. And now look at Arman's situation, right? He's either going to have to sit out for at least the next 10 months, assuming that Ilia Topuria comes back in June, or Arman's just going to have to take another #1 contender fight. That's 3 #1 contender fights in the last 2 to 3 years. When he fought Charles Oliveira, that was a #1 contender fight. When he fought Dan Hooker, that was a #1 contender fight. And now he's most likely going to have to fight again. Honestly, if I was Arman, I would just stay active because he's clearly so much better than everybody else in this top 10 of the lightweight division right now, aside from maybe Ilia Topuria. But this is just honestly sloppy matchmaking by the UFC, man. It was very clear the matchups that they should have done, but for whatever reason, they just choose to annoy their fan base. And it's honestly sad that Amanda Nunes versus Kayla Harrison is going to be overlooked by this main event because most people are just going to be complaining about this card. But yeah, those are my immediate thoughts on Dana White's announcement for UFC 324. Let me know what you guys think. Make sure you guys do drop a like on this video and make sure to subscribe as well, man. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.